meltdown can be viewed as consisting of three phases. There's the escalation of anxiety, the explosion of pent-up anxiety, and post-explosion. Together, they make up the meltdown cycle. In this process, the escalation phase is characterized by cues that indicate anxiety is building. Now, these cues can be physical, behavioral, emotional, or cognitive, and they are warning signs or responses to anxiety-provoking events. Events, on the other hand, are situations that occur every day that may lead to escalations of anxiety if effective anxiety control methods are not used. Red flag events are types of situations that are unique to you and that you are especially sensitive to because of past events. And these events can involve internal processes, for example, thinking about situations that were anxiety-provoking in the past, or external processes, for example, experiencing real-life anxiety-provoking situations in the here and now. If the escalation phase is allowed to continue, the explosion phase will follow. Now, the explosion phase is marked by an uncontrollable discharge of anxiety displayed as verbal or physical aggression. Now, this discharge in turn leads to negative consequences, and it's synonymous with the number 10 on an emotional dysregulation meter. You could think of this meter as similar to a thermometer. The final stage of the meltdown cycle is the post-explosion phase, and it's characterized by negative consequences that resulted from the verbal or physical aggression that was displayed during the explosion phase. These consequences could include feelings of guilt, shame, regret, a post-meltdown shutdown. In other words, he explodes and then later on he goes and hibernates and isolates and tries to stay away from people. Separation or divorce, family members and friends that no longer want to be around you, being terminated from a job, and in some cases even going to jail. Now, the intensity, frequency, and duration of anxiety in a meltdown cycle varies among individuals. For example, one person's anxiety may escalate rapidly after a provocative event and within just a few minutes reach the explosion phase. Another's anxiety may escalate slowly but steadily over several hours before reaching the explosion phase. So it will be important to understand your pattern here. In other words, do you go from 1 to 100 miles an hour quickly, or do you creep up from 1 mile an hour to 100 miles an hour over the course of several minutes or even up to an hour? Also, one may experience more episodes of anxiety and progress through the meltdown cycle more often than the other. However, both people, despite differences in how quickly their anxiety escalates and how frequently they experience anxiety, will undergo all three phases of the meltdown cycle. The intensity of anxiety from one person to the next also will be different. One person may engage in more violent behavior than the other in the explosion phase. For example, he might assault someone. The other person may express his anxiety during the explosion phase by shouting at or threatening another person. But regardless of these individual differences, the explosion phase is synonymous with losing control and becoming verbally or physically aggressive, and we call this emotional dysregulation. Another term that is used but doesn't quite capture the severity of this situation is low frustration tolerance. Now, notice that the escalation and explosion phases of the meltdown cycle correspond to the levels on the emotional dysregulation meter. The points below 10 on the meter represent the escalation phase, or the building up of anxiety. The explosion phase, on the other hand, corresponds to 10 on this meter, and it is kind of an imaginary meter at this point. So again, 10 on the meter is the point at which one loses control and expresses anxiety through verbal or physical aggression that leads to negative consequences. One of the primary objectives of anxiety control treatment is to keep from reaching the explosion phase. And this is accomplished by using the emotional dysregulation meter to monitor changes in your anxiety, attending to the cues or warning signs that indicate anxiety is building, and employing the appropriate methods from your anxiety control plan to stop escalation. If the explosion phase is prevented from occurring, the post-explosion phase will not occur and the meltdown cycle will be broken. So if you use your anxiety control plan effectively, your anxiety should ideally reach between a 1 and a 9 on the emotional dysregulation meter. By preventing the explosion phase, which is a 10, you will not experience the same level of negative consequences of the post-explosion phase, and you will then be able to break the destructive cycle.